Well, hello, everyone. I'm absolutely giddy to host this panel on the topic of green software, where we have three very distinguished members of the Green Software Foundation. So we have Scott Chamberlin from Intel, we have Lisa McNally from Thoughtworks, and we have Santiago Fontanarrosa. How bad did I butcher your last name?
You did great.
Wow. From Globant. So appreciate you all being here and to talk about the Green Software Foundation and the mission of building a trusted ecosystem of people, standards, toolings, and best practice. And we're here to talk about those things. And we're going to dive into a little bit of the tech culture, knowledge, and tooling. So let's get started. All right. Well, this was something that I'm particularly interested in, and it's pertaining to tech culture, right? So, how have you seen the tech culture around sustainability change over the last few years? And where do you see it in 5 years? Who wants to start?
I can jump in there, I think it's probably clear with most of our panelists that we've probably seen it go from little to nothing to pretty pervasive. And the one data point that I was really just blown away by was I was reviewing the different talks at the OCP summit that's happening. I think it's this week. And it's really data center focused. It's a little bit as a, hardware focused, but I would say a fifth of the talks had some sustainability aspect with them. And that's something you would not have seen, 3 or 4 years ago. So at least for that audience, I think the understanding that's an important thing to talk about in those communities is really relevant right now. And where are we going to be 5 years from now? I think we will definitely have a combination of it being super embedded into the daily practices, which, I think we're at the bleeding edge of that right now. And from there, we'll see, bleeding edge research, as well as, a set of expectations, both culturally, like you mentioned, as well as regulatory, about how we, develop software that consumes or emits large amount of carbon dioxide. So.
Yeah, I've seen that too, just in the last, I'd say 2 years of my being in this space, just in 2 years, seeing the change. And I know that just in any industry, not just the tech sector, but also in the tech sector, cost and performance tend to be the big drivers around why we go to conferences, why we read articles. It's always looking at ways to improve cost and performance. And perhaps I'm just seeing this through the biased lens because I approach my work from the sustainability side, but I truly have been seeing more of the sustainability piece being brought into those discussions and having conferences and media, points of media really focused on sustainability being that primary driver from the perspective that sustainability and profit aren't necessarily in conflict with one another, which years ago that tended to be you were either on one side or the other of that spectrum, and it felt more there was more of this kind of like throwing meat at one another on both sides of the spectrum, saying no, it's profit, no, it's sustainability, and now it's kind of like, those actually could go very well together. Now, of course, you need the tools, you need the standards, and I know we'll probably talk a little bit about that in order to help them be more complementary, but I'm not seeing as much resistance towards those two kind of areas of business being in conflict with one another.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? I see that too, and yeah, I absolutely applaud that. Santiago, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, just to add that, as Scott was mentioned, and Lisa, there is no longer a conflict between sustainability and business. And in my personal opinion, what I'm seeing going forward is that nowadays, no one questions the security or quality be part of the development process. And I envision that in the near future, sustainability will also be that part. And no one is going to question that. So it will be like at the core of the business when you work on software or any digital solution. So when we can say that the next evolution of the digital transformation will be a sustainable digital transformation.
Yeah, I want to say it's gone beyond from viewed as a potential conflict to an expectation.
Mhm.
We have RFPs, we have, specifications. We have a lot of things where it's, you must do X, Y, and Z if we're even going to consider your solution. It's starting at, open data and carbon footprint data, but it's, I think over the next few years, it's going to extend way beyond that as we develop these standards and the expectations of what is possible.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. We've seen a lot of change in how large tech vendors are approaching sustainability, right? So how have you guys seen this change? And do you have any advice for an organization looking to embrace green software in their products and offerings?
I think I will take this one first.
Sure.
I think that big companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, implementing and disclosing this kind of information related to a technology is a big boost, and it's a vote of confidence that when we go and talk about sustainability in the software development and software itself, it's no longer that you are like the outsider. And being these companies talking about that make more people wanting to implement that and embrace that. And my advice would be for companies that this is going to happen. This is here and it's not going away. You can be leading this or you can get behind. The same happened with digital transformation. The companies that invest at the right moment were the ones that now are leading the changes. So either you lead or you get behind.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I totally what Santiago is saying, I'm completely agree. And I think there's this like element of legitimizing the emissions being a critical aspect of the impacts that these large tech vendors are having, and accepting that, acknowledging it, and actually providing the transparency into what that data is. Some I think are a little more transparent than others, but I think there's this kind of broad awareness too that the tech sector is a generator of emissions, and that you continuously need to understand what the emissions are associated with your demand, and the problem isn't solved once you migrate to the cloud, or the problem isn't solved if you generate or run your data center just by renewable energy, because we know that something like 80% of electricity generated in the world is still fossil fuel based. So it really starts to pull away the layers of what it really means to be a sustainable tech vendor and to be sustainable in the tech sector, and not just find a one-off solution like using renewable energy to power your data center. So I think that, and getting into the complexity of it and having these vendors drive that is really important. And then so is the work that the Green Software Foundation is having around kind of an open source platform where various experts like on this panel can come together and share their different perspectives, both from a socio-political aspect, from a community aspect, from a tech aspect, and share that information and not hoard it, because we are at, I think it was Scott said, at the bleeding edge of this is new, and we need everyone participating and figuring out what those best approaches are. So I think the tech vendors are inviting that, and the collaboration is there as we see with the foundation. So I think that's been kind of a different shift, I think, in the ways that tech vendors compete with one another and work with one another. So I think I've been happy to see that.
Scott, did you want to weigh in on any advice for embracing green software and products and offerings?
Just in general, yeah, I think the advice I tend to give people if you're embracing green software product offerings is, the first off is really to create what I would call a carbon impact estimate, right? It's like, if I'm going to go tackle this, what is the potential? Can I even say today what the carbon impact of my software is?
Right.
And if I can quantify that, which is an unbelievably hard challenge in certain environments, And once I'm able to quantify that, can I set some sort of goals for reduction of that? Like, and like Lisa was saying, it's not always as easy as just buying renewable energy or buying carbon offsets, which is actually carbon offsets doesn't necessarily solve all the problems we want it to solve. And so once you have that estimate, and once you have an estimate of how much you might potentially be able to reduce through the things the Green Software, Foundation is advocating, different patterns and practices, how much do you think you can reduce, and what is what I call carbon ROI of that, the carbon return on investments? How much are you going to invest in that, or how much CO2 savings? Because you got to pencil all this stuff out. When you think about certain applications, sometimes the carbon ROI just doesn't pan out. I'm just sorry, it just doesn't. But certain other applications, especially that have broad scale deployments for high, really energy intensive profiles, they totally do pencil out. So understand that up front, understand how much work it's going to take to make a change, and how pervasive that change can happen, and be able to quantify the impact you're going to get from your efforts.
All right. Makes sense. So what we've been talking about is really around tech culture, right? Is there any last thoughts, and we'll kind of move on to the knowledge aspect surrounding green software?
In particular, there's a trend I have seen in the last couple of months that sustainability has become a decision aspect when you need to hire or to retain one person in the company. So that for me was I would not say surprising, but yet the velocity that it caused inside get into the company. So for me that is a direct impact on the culture of any company.
Yes, absolutely. All right, let's move into the knowledge. What are the advantages to an organization in having a workforce literate in green software principles? Anyone want to weigh in?
Yeah, let's go.
Oh, okay. I think the first advantage that we really see is that the software ecosystem is gigantic. I mean, there's the amount of pieces of software out there, I'm sure in the millions, or tens of millions, or hundreds of millions. Now, to have the pervasive changes that the GSF is advocating, right? You potentially have to touch a lot of pieces of code to do that, to just address where we're at today, but to address where we're going in the future. Having a knowledge basis within your organization about what the GSF principles are, how to measure the carbon impact of your software, how to reduce the carbon impact of your software. Number one, helps make the largest impact possible to the global problems that we have. And number two, help prevent new problems as they arise. For example, one thing that we think about a lot is like say in deep learning, large language models, pervasive high energy training operations. Like, as we are working at the bleeding edge of the technology of what deep learning can do, if we had people also thinking about the carbon impact at the same time, things like model optimization, things like carbon aware training, scheduling, things like, compression, that has sometimes other reasons for performance, to bleed into your ML work, they might get brought in from a carbon impact work and prevent us from growing the problem as fast as we've grown it in the past.
Good point. Santiago?
I totally agree, as Scott was mentioned about, for me, is in the last couple of years, optimization, many of, let's say, no mission critical applications have been neglected because storage is cheap and easy to set up. The velocity of the communication have increased exponentially. So nowadays, I will say that we lost or passed back into the optimization. So when we talk about new developers, they are not worried about that. So maybe bringing optimization, bringing the sustainable part and the green coding will also imply optimization and reapply techniques that have been around for a long time.
Mhm.
Let's say, for example, the training, a machine learning training model. This will imply that we need to be more carefully how we use our resources. And I'm not talking about just emission, I'm talking about memory, I'm talking about servers. So even though you don't want to carry or worry about sustainability, which you should be, at least you will be introducing optimization of your resources, physical resources, or maybe, I don't know, the cloud resources or wherever. So I see a value on that for organization to start thinking about this new approach when we talk about software and development and new technology.
Yeah, and I would also say that, you know, having a workforce literate in green software principles can really help promote, this kind of goes back to the previous discussion, promote a sustainability culture more across the organization, because it helps to integrate the green software principles as kind of this cross-functional requirement. And so you start to educate those who are also making decisions, not within that just the IT sector, but you have the other, say, directors or owners of budgets understanding what those metrics are and kind of starting to think about this more comprehensively. And that can be driven by green software principles and the metrics that are used. So that's kind of being able to leverage those principles as maybe a catalyst for those cross-functional requirements and decision-making. And I also think that depending on how a company prioritizes the adoption of the principles, and we've seen the tech vendors and those who are on the panel being those who are really obviously seeing this as a priority, I think you know, you can benefit from the technical aspects, from reduced energy consumption optimization, just using basic principles of getting more output per gram of carbon in the work that you do, but also the cultural ones that we talked about, with teams being empowered and incentivized to make different decisions based on not just cost, but also on the sustainability emissions impacts of those decisions that they themselves are doing every day as practitioners. And then again, it just really, those metrics are something that I think we'll continue to talk about as bringing a standard approach to understanding and getting insight into what the impacts of your day-to-day work are, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit here on the panel.
Awesome. So in your journey into this space, what is something that you learned that really changed or framed how you see sustainability in technology?
Say for me, I have been deep in technology for almost 15 years, right? But for me, it was like reshape everything that have been done in the past and have a new lens. So it gives me a new complete perspective, and it make me rethink about some problems that I have solved in the past, some applications, some solutions, even some recommendations I have been given to clients. And it's a whole new way of thinking about the problems we need to solve. I will think about technology as a tool to solve problems. And now it's like you add this new, let's say, layers complexity. So it's bring you to the next level. And for me, it was like a new challenge. We need to challenge this. And I'm not talking just about, it's important in the personal level for the commitment to the environment, but also from the professional point of view. So nowadays, it's, let's say, push the boundaries on how we do things. And that for me was a big change on my career.
Yeah, for me personally, I was trying to learn more about sustainability in my day-to-day life, right? And doing all the things that I thought that you should do with recycle and reuse and, eliminate one and dones, and working in technology, I started to look inside my job. And for me, the biggest thing that kind of framed this for me was coming across those principles, right? I get asked all the time, well, what is green software really? And what does that mean, right? And just those early principles and being able to, learn about them was really a aha moment for me.
Yeah, totally. The same
Yeah.
happened to me. I came across that and was aha moment.
Yeah, I mean, and someone coming from the transportation sector and really starting her career, almost 20 years ago. So in the transportation sector, what we really focused on as a consultant, what I brought our clients was this idea of transportation demand management. What are the ways that you can change your behavior and be less dependent on single occupancy vehicle, VMT, vehicles miles traveled, all of this. It's all about the behavior change and the awareness, but also shifting to a different use. So we called that, transportation demand management or demand management. And as I started learning about green software, and it seemed a little like nebulous to me at first, and I really started looking at it, it's also about demand shaping. We can use technology to shape our own demand in usage of the technology itself. And in fact, because we only continue to become more dependent on technology, for me, I'm like, transportation sector, huge area of emissions, but you know what? The tech sector is now that area, and this is really where we should be focused. We can bring a lot of those other principles here, but we've got, the transportation sector is well on its way with the electric vehicles. There's obviously things we need to do there, but wow, there's so much opportunity for us in this space, and that demand shaping, the carbon aware, the carbon efficiency, all of that type of work actually will have a significant impact, because when we look at the overall impact that tech is having today, it's not insignificant. It's on par with the aviation industry globally. So I'm really excited about that. And then it all clicked into place like, yeah, that's what that means. It means that it's about the electricity usage. It's a one-for-one connection there. And it just wasn't clear to me at first. And I think that's super important for us to continue to bring that awareness, that it's not as mysterious. Of course, there's a lot of work to be done, but there is a direct throughput that we can continue to educate others on.
I'll build on what Lisa was saying about, I kind of heard her like alluding to kind of systems thinking, right? And I think one of the most profound learnings that I had while being on this journey is the understanding the interplay between what we're doing, say on the demand shaping side or on the how technology uses energy side, and how that has the potential to interact with how the grid is built out and how you get better utilization from renewable energy and minimize utilization from coal and dirtier fossil fuels. And that interplay is really interesting, and thinking about it as a system. And then you can even add another layer of complexity in that, thinking the embodied carbon aspects of all the technology you're using and the interplay with that. And you end up having to approach this problem from the point of view of a large scale, like global optimization problem, where the goal is lowering the amount of CO2 in aggregate, but sometimes the interplay between lowering in one place and the impact of that is not necessarily always obvious. And so I think just approaching my work from that point of view is that there's a lot of ways of making impact, software being where we're all having, putting a lot of our mind share in, but there's a lot of other things that we cannot ignore that have positive or negative impacts too, and we have to think about it as a whole system.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to tooling. So if you can't measure it, you can't reduce it, right? Last year, the Green Software Foundation released the alpha version of the Software Carbon Intensity Specification, or SCI. What are some of the challenges that the SCI helps resolve?
I think the main challenge is that, every time you approach measuring something, right, as amorphous as software, right? Software, like what you define as software, is pretty different. Depends on what type of application developer you are. And I think the SCI kind of provides a nice general way of approaching it. And then like, you know, I think there's a good insight in approaching it as a rate in terms of, you know, a software operations, stuff like that. So it helps make a lot of those questions easier while allowing you to frame up some of the per domain specific, you know, questions you'll have to answer depending on what type of application developer you are.
Yeah, I mean, I think it lays a really strong foundation for a standard, right? With that kind of consistent taxonomy of how you can actually make comparisons within the sector, apples to apples, and maybe potentially comparisons beyond the tech sector. I mean, as we start to evolve. I mean, I think one of the important things too is that it's in alpha, and all things start in alpha. And the Green Software Foundation has really been encouraging people to, as a community of practitioners, to really start applying this standard and really starting to get feedback to shape kind of how it can be the best kind of common denominator, so to speak, of how we measure. You know, to act as a standard, it's something we need, but it's kind of one of those gaps that we're looking to fill there. And it also allows us to hopefully measure progress, and rather than kind of going in circles, maybe it will become more of a linear thing where over time we really start to understand, after we can kind of set our baseline, kind of where we can make these meaningful reductions, and setting those goals that are based on something, some rate, some there. So I think this has really kind of helped us to move in a direction where we're all kind of looking in the same direction, and hopefully start to lay that groundwork for a standard.
Yeah. And this is a great, you know, first step, right? The alpha version being released. But what kind of tooling would you guys love to see in 5 years that maybe doesn't exist today? If you could put your future hats on for a second, where would you see that going?
I would say that nowadays we are seeing a lot of tools that allow us to be more productive, like for example, GitHub Copilot. And I would like to see something around that, something that allows or give us more information that allow us to make better decisions and incorporate sustainability as one of the KPIs, as many ones. For example, I believe that the SDK, Aware SDK, that have been generated is a great example of a tool that allows us to make decisions. And I think that in the future, we need to have more and more tools that allow us to have that information in real time and make decisions, or even incorporate it, that we don't have to worry about it. So when I producing some piece of software, let's say the compiler, we take that into account and will produce the most optimal code, but at the same time will be the sustainable way of use the energy that is going to be consumed.
Yeah, standing on that, like, you know, having an SDK is totally step one. You know, if building out 5 years from now, what I would love to see is having it more integrated into the programming languages themselves, into, say, like contracts that you would build your, you know, pieces of your application around. And say, you know, say I have a, you know, I'm writing, you know, an asynchronous application, and I want to kick off a, you know, a process that says, hey, this process, you know, I don't have a latency requirement, it can be carbon aware. And then all I have to do is tag it in my programming language, and then everything else is handled for me. So as a developer, I don't necessarily need to be at that time like a domain expert on how the energy grid works, which is somewhat you have to do today to do this right. But in the future, I want to just be able to know these are the right concepts, and if they are applicable in these, you know, problem spaces, and that everything, all the really good logic is built into the languages, built into the frameworks, and we have a very mature ecosystem there that makes doing this at scale really easy.
Yeah, it's so wide open right now. There's just, you know, so much potential out there, and so many different ways that I can definitely see us moving this and helping developers make better decisions for sure.
Yeah, and just to add on that too, I mean, not just developers, if I were to just think really big in 5 years' time, I would love for just the average consumer to have some ability to get that kind of immediate dashboard look into their energy consumption on their, say, on their homepage or something, kind of like the Prius dashboard that, to what Scott just said, like you don't need to be a domain expert to understand how an engine works or how a Prius battery works or any of that. You just get that kind of output, just any lay person can see it and kind of understand it. Kind of sometimes I know there's a gamification component of it where you're always trying to optimize to make sure you're getting the most efficient usage, but that could be kind of cool too, to have everyone have this be kind of like business as usual norm for any consumer. Like we have a watch, we have a watch on, we have our clock, and we also have right below it kind of the carbon intensity associated with maybe your computer usage, but also other things in your home that are all kind of being used to pull energy off the grid.
Absolutely. Okay, I know we talked a little bit about the Carbon Aware SDK and we kind of elaborated on it, but any last thoughts about how you can see organizations leveraging the SDK, and just for clarity for those that don't know, it's the Carbon Aware SDK was just released by the Green Software Foundation, and it's a way of pulling grid data to help with those decisions. So any other ways that you guys could see the SDK assisting your companies?
I think it's somewhat related to what I was just mentioning, but I think there's this consumer
Right.
amplification component. So you have the companies themselves, maybe the tech companies doing this work internally so they can meet their own sustainability goals. But then you also have the potential and promise of them taking a lot of these learnings and applying it to the products and services that they're providing their customers. So you're really kind of you're amplifying kind of the awareness piece of it, and customers, like I was talking about, having some dashboard. You can put that on appliances and other things to help the customers then get more, become more mindful about the ways that their appliances or other things are consuming energy, both based on time and location. So I think there's a lot of promise there too, in addition to everything else we've been talking about here in terms of the tech companies using this themselves.
I think what we're seeing, at least with carbon awareness, right, we're seeing the first few applications of it outside of charging. And, I think bringing it into, let's say, Intel in my case, or, in other large organizations, and this is exactly what we're also seeing with the hackathon, is that this is a concept connecting how a piece of code behaves with the behavior of the energy grid that I think unlocks a huge amount of creativity for a lot of people. And so, at least bringing it in Intel, what we anticipate is that there will be new use cases we never thought about before. There will be high energy, and CO2 impact opportunities we'll identify when we start to think about this, because like I mentioned before, most software developers are not familiar with how the energy grid works, though we are seeing a lot of interest in that. And once you start, and the Carbon Aware SDK kind of makes that more approachable, and you unlock that creativity once you connect the dots for people. As they're doing this, they realize, hey, I might not only be optimizing for performance, latency, reliability, some of the things we are used to optimizing for, but I can also optimize for carbon, and maybe that's the appropriate thing for my software application. And we're going to see massive amounts of new innovation in this space, I believe, in the coming years as organizations adopt it. And I think that's the value of the SDK, is making it easier to adopt. You don't have to roll your own. You don't have to, provide that intermediate, logic, which you'd had to prior to this.
It's starting to build the easy button, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, as we start to wrap things up today, any last thoughts you guys have before we say goodbye? No?
For me, it will be like, it's very important that this kind of event, webinars, and tooling are start to emerge and be known by the community, and not only the development community, because I was thinking what Lisa was mentioned, when we design or we create a new product, can be a digital product or not, we need to start embedding sustainability. And the SDK, as Scott was mentioned, is the first step, but it will unleash a lot of innovation that will go beyond just the digital technology. And so the more and more we start thinking about this, the more and more new ideas and new way of doing things will start happening. So that for me is very important that we advocate for this and we start doing as much as possible, everyone from our own side, right? But there should be a strong commitment from the personal aspect, but also from the company aspect around this.
I would just add to that is that, I think one of the huge challenges that I hear people saying when trying to drive change in their organization about sustainability in software or in technology in general is feeling like they haven't yet had support, and not every organization has schools in this space or has invested in this space yet. So I just kind of want to say, like, hey, we've all been there. We are all starting the beginnings of cultural change, and it's going to take a little bit of time, but it takes people investing, taking a little bit of risk, proving out the data, building the business cases, connecting the dots for your organization. Like we all started out with, like, we do believe it's going to be a business requirement in the future, if it's not already today in some locations. And so for those people who feel like it's incredibly challenging in their organization, which we hear you, and just like, use the GSF as resources, use us as resources to help there, because all of us have gone through some aspect of, trying to drive that cultural change, and, you're not alone. That's one of the reasons the GSF has this community. So.
That's awesome, Scott. Those are great. Great last thoughts. So it's been a pleasure to talk to you guys today. Hopefully my dog wasn't too much a distraction. I don't know if you even heard him, but they went off a few times during the course. But appreciate the wonderful conversation about green software. I could talk all day about this. And I definitely appreciate what the foundation is doing with building, the trusted ecosystem, right, of people. And we've got some great people in the foundation, great companies that are trying to make a difference, creating those standards, building the tooling, and all in all, sharing of those best practices to advance the idea of green software. And I'm very excited about that topic, and I definitely appreciate all the great minds in the panel today. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
Thanks, Tammy.
Thanks, guys.